months to observe the ways in which counsel can examine witnesses. Most of them had practiced cross-examination on prosecution witnesses, and some of them had shown a natural aptitude for it, comfort, and learned a lot more from the examples and failures of their adversaries. They could also have relished a right denied them under German law, but secured for them by the International Military Tribunal. At Nuremberg, each defendant might give evidence in his own defense, although if he chose to do so, he must take the oath and submit to cross-examination by the prosecution. This was standard practice in British and American courts, but not on the continent. But awareness of the right seems to have come as a bombshell to the Russians in February. They behaved as if they had never read the Charter, or at least had failed to realize what it meant. They said they were appalled by the prospect of defendants testifying under oath. In a private session of the judges on the 20th of February, they refused point-blank to allow it. Biddle recorded that the session developed into a terrific fight. Nikitchenko maintained a vigorous objection to the procedure. Parker was so shocked at the thought that defendants might be robbed of a right that he threatened to resign. Biddle issued a stern rebuke to Parker for considering such extreme protest. Finally, enough order was restored for a vote to be held, and the other judges voted the Russians down. But that was not the end of the matter. The Russians would not be pacified. They next refused to countenance the idea that defendants and their witnesses would sit in the very same box as that used by the prosecution witnesses. They reacted as if sacrilege was about to be committed on sanctified fabric. There was no reasoning with them. The meeting broke down with no decision and a deal of bad feeling on both sides. It was a rare example of the judges failing to settle arguments amicably and with common sense. Lawrence had to repair unity and broken tempers. He tried a private approach to Nikitchenko and the suggestion that the real issue to be settled was one of security. The witness box stood near the end of the tribunal's bench, and a defendant might be able to aim a blow at the judge. Presumably, the handiest target would have been Volskov. Why not move the box to a safer position? Once moved, would it really be occupying the prosecution's ground? So might it not be seen as a rather different box? The security argument was thin, the symbolism of the move was threadbare, but they were enough for Nikitchenko. He must have recovered his temper and been pleased by any opportunity to display his usual practical and cooperative spirit. He seized the proffered olive branch, and good relations between the judges were restored. Anglo-American rights and obligations had been conferred on the defendants. Ribbentrop's counsel was none too pleased. He protested that the procedure was unfair to his client. If he meant that his client would be incapable of standing up to cross-examination or even working through a prepared defense in court, he was right. But others welcomed the chance for defendants to present their cases personally and with the guidance of their counsel. Whatever the advantages or disadvantages of the procedure evolved for the Nuremberg trial, whatever the grounds for complaints about it, there is little doubt that the physical conditions in which the defense had to be prepared were far from comfortable. Defendants and their counsel met in room 55 in the Palais de Justice, the defendants' visitors' center. It was a large room, originally simply furnished with rows of tables and chairs. Inevitably, it was noisy. Concentration was difficult against the background hubbub from 20 other discussions. It became even harder when those responsible for security exclaimed in horror at the sight of open tables and insisted on putting the defendants into separate booths and cutting them off from their counsel with mesh grills. The partitions were flimsy and did not reach the ceiling, so did nothing for sound insulation. The fine wire mesh made people feel sick or giddy, and eventually one central section had to be replaced with a glass panel. But everyone then had to raise their voices to penetrate to the other side, making the room even noisier and the strain of working there even greater. Rivalry broke out as defendants staked claims to booths thought to be quiet. Goering, asserting his position as number one survivor of the Reich and number one on the indictment, grabbed booth number one. It abutted onto the wall of the outer office, so was only exposed to sound from one side. He did not keep his privileged position for long. Emma Schwabenland, who was in charge of the defendant's visitors' center, soon established a rota for the use of the booth. Everyone was to have a chance of enjoying relative calm and quiet. Emma Schwabenland was an outstanding example of how individuals could do something by small gestures to ease the unpleasant lot of the defendant. It was possible to maintain the consideration and good manners which would be expected in the outside world, but which were too often forgotten in Nuremberg in relations with former enemies and potential security risks. Miss Schwabenland was an American schoolteacher who had learned German when she spent a year as an exchange teacher in a German school. She had come to Nuremberg as a translator of documents. The Colonel Dostek, who always possessed a good eye, must have soon recognized her as conscientious and sensible. He asked her to take over the center, originally just to help those German counsel who did not speak English, and insisted that they be treated with every courtesy. There was no need to insist. Miss Schwabenland would not have behaved in any other way. Her role and usefulness soon expanded. She imposed proper behavior in the center as she would have imposed it in her classroom. She was firm, but not a martinet. Defendants drilled to stand to attention when Allied officers appeared were allowed to remain seated as Miss Schwabenland hopped in and out of their room. By small acts of concern and sensitivity, she soothed the irritations of their counsel. For instance, she kept matches for them. Lawyers were allocated a cigarette ration, but matches were unobtainable. She got them shoelaces and saved light bulbs thrown away by profligate electricians. Where there seemed no sense in sticking to the rules, she bent or broke them. Defense lawyers, like all Germans, were forbidden to write to relatives abroad. This was a source of anxiety and distress. Miss Schwabenland was prepared to accept a few letters from trusted counsel, vet them, and forward them to her own relatives to the state. She defied the prohibition on fraternization and invited favorite counsel to pardon. Gradually, her help was extended to the prison chaplains, who were responsible for reading most of the prisoners' incoming mail. Her knowledge of German and her tact were useful to them when large numbers of letters were arriving. There was no gossip about what had been read. When letters were vitriolic or threatening, which they often were, they were simply dropped in the waste paper basket. Whatever problems and discomforts the defense faced, they could not overlook for long the fundamental, inescapable worry. How could they counter the prosecution case? They had heard grave charges, backed by telling witnesses and damning documentary evidence, often quoting the defendants themselves. It was a frightening challenge to find holes in such a case. What could the defense hope to find that might extenuate their clients, let alone disprove the charges? The defendants had met daily until the imposition of separate lunchrooms and solitary confinement. The record of their discussions during these months suggests that few of them had begun to entertain the possibility of a genuine defense. There was little doubt that the alleged crimes had taken place, merely assertion that others had borne even greater responsibility for them. Such scraps of favorable evidence as they found challenged only details of the prosecution case and did not amount to a real counterattack against the whole. The best the defendants could do was to agree to pass on any useful documents which might turn up, though Pritchard suggests that the military were reluctant to do this and promised not to save their own skins by turning against each other. A blame could be hurled at the dead, at Himmler and Goebbels, though preferably not Hitler, but not at fellow defendants. Some of the American staff had hoped to drive wedges between defendants by coaxing individuals to turn kings or states evidence. The Russians had prepared denunciations for Pritchard to sign when he was in the Lubyanka. Several American counsel wanted to develop contacts with German lawyers to test the willingness of their clients to cooperate. Goering would have been the most desirable prey. It was argued that his vanity would make him vulnerable to an approach from the prosecution, and that his desire to play the hero would lead him to give a full account of Nazi policies in the belief that he was defending and promulgating them. Robert Kempner was sent to make contact. A German native, even once Goering's subordinate in the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, if only for a few days. Stahmer, Goering's counsel, nosed the bait, nibbled briefly, and suggested that Goering might lend assistance in return for a promise that he would be shot by a firing squad rather than hanged like a common criminal. The Americans would make no promises. They got no statement. Kempner himself says he had undertaken the negotiation reluctantly. He felt that no one should deal with such a man. No one should sup with such a devil, however long he has been. Jackson, too, was resolutely set against the idea. He thought that any bargaining or backstage negotiation with the defendants was outrageous in a great trial involving profound moral and legal issues. If his hopes for a major and lasting development in international law were to be realized, he felt that the tribunal's judgment must be based on law and on the evidence it had weighed, not on lawyers' tricks and testimony extorted from the frightened hoping for leniency. Furthermore, he had too much confidence in the strength of his case to need to resort to trading and enticement. Some of his colleagues were not convinced. Bill Donovan, in particular, wanted to pursue the line of getting defendants to denounce their regime or their colleagues. Paradoxically, the possibility of splitting the defense resulted in an irreparable division in the prosecution team. Donovan was taken by a subtle approach from Schacht in November 1945. Schacht's lawyer wrote Donovan a flattering letter praising his high standing, experience, and wisdom. It suggested that his client might consider providing a brief summary of the underlying reasons and conditions of the Nazi regime. It was the most delicate of hints. If challenged, Schacht could easily assume righteous indignation, one of his great talents, and deny he had offered real cooperation. Donovan was excited by it, however, and urged Jackson to follow it up. He argued it was unnecessary to give any promises or make any bargains. Jackson was not to be persuaded. His refusal and Donovan's continued enthusiasm for the attempt finally severed their already strained relations. The result of Donovan's resentment of Jackson's authority in the team and his failure to make witnesses rather than documents a major part of the case. Jackson was emphatic. We do not see alike about the defendant such as Schacht. I do not think he will help us convict anyone we do not already have convicted on the document. Riled by Donovan's insistence, he now refused to allow him to cross-examine any defense witness. This was the last straw. Donovan replied with a strongly worded memo criticizing Jackson's handling of the whole prosecution case and stating his intention to leave Nuremberg. He did so soon afterwards. Schacht had not been alone in sounding out the prosecution's attitude. Keitel had pondered the possibility of salving his conscience. He had discussed the idea of making an offer to the prosecution in his early interrogations with Thomas Dodd. Dr. Nelter, Keitel's lawyer, then told Robert Kempner of his client's willingness to assume full responsibility for his orders so as to relieve his subordinates of blame. Kempner made no promises. He just sent the message to Keitel to go ahead and confess if he wished. Keitel, however, got cold feet. Never in his life had he acted willingly on his own initiative. His counsel might have suggested that a confession could produce some mitigation of sentence, make the task of defending the general staff easier. But Keitel was used to acting not on suggestions, but on orders from superior officers. He consulted Goering. Goering's views were predictable. On no account were the defendants to break rank and weaken the united front. Keitel wrote to Kempner to explain that after a sleepless night, he had changed his mind. There would be no confession. Denied cooperation from the defense, the prosecutors had to rely on their own wits and on carefully prepared cross-examinations to fend off counterattack during the defense case. As early as October, they had tried to anticipate the approach the defendants might take. Jackson had warned that they must expect applications for such witnesses as Churchill and Molotov. He had been ready to urge the tribunal to ask for proofs of relevance before such prestigious witnesses were obliged to appear in court. In the event, the tribunal needed no urging to establish its rules for granting defense witnesses and documents. At the meeting of chief prosecutors on the 30th of October, Jackson and Maxwell Fyfe reached the same conclusion from Yodel's request for records of war crimes committed by the Allies, namely that the defense was preparing a case based on tu quoque and the right of reprisal. They agreed to invoke the charter to stymie the use of tu quoque, and Maxwell Fyfe suggested reminding the tribunal that at the Leipzig trials after the First World War, the German judges had ruled it out of order. Even so, all agreed to prepare lists of possible defense allegations and to draw up lists of answers to them. In particular, the British, Americans and Russians were continually worried that the would be accused of mistreatment of German prisoners of war. There had been plenty of publicity about the conditions in which these prisoners were kept, and the highly critical have talked them out of their folly, although prosecution minutes do not record how it was done, because the matter was not raised in the French section of the prosecution. By mid-November, the British were worried that they would be accused of condoning breaches of the naval clauses of the Versailles Treaty by signing the 1935 Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Maxwell 5 thought it would be possible to argue that the treaty still stood vis-à-vis its other signatories, and that British assent to the agreement was only obtained because the Germans gave false information about the size and condition of their existing fleet. To be on the safe side, however, requests were sent to the Foreign Office for help in establishing the details. All the prosecutors feared the defense would argue that the foreign policy of others had encouraged that of Germany. The defendants might claim that other nations had condoned breaches of the Versailles Treaty, from the occupation of the Rhineland to the takeover of Czechoslovakia, had indeed been ready to negotiate over such questions as the incorporation of the Sudetenland. Furthermore, the defense could trade on the fact that although the Allies now accused the Nazi government of crimes against its own citizens, every one of their own governments had recognized that regime in 1933 and had continued to maintain diplomatic relations with it up to the outbreak of war. The chief prosecutors appeared not to realize that the argument was fallacious. Recognition never implies approval. At the chief prosecutors' meeting on the 30th of October, Pokrovsky dismissed their fears on other grounds, that the judges did not assemble to hear their own governments criticized. The others were less optimistic. Maxwell Fyfe and de Monton preferred the argument that their governments had acted in good faith, but had been deceived by the lies and false assurances of the Nazis. A more acute and time-consuming cause for concern for the British prosecutors arose from their belief that the naval and military defendants were preparing to claim that Germany had invaded Norway only to preempt a planned British attack. Requests for documents by Goering and Raeder pointed to Norway as a topic they intended to study. Questions prepared by Keitel for an interrogatory for Churchill's nephew, captured at Narvik, indicated that he intended to examine British invasion plans. A defense counsel were known to have obtained the white books on Norway containing documents said to have been captured during the German invasion, showing that the British carefully prepared plans which the Germans had only narrowly averted. Given this clear warning of defense targets, the British prosecutors wanted full information and all the help they could get on the matter. Instead, they met point-blank refusal from their own government. Attlee, now Prime Minister, snapped, "We are not on trial," and opposed sending any government documents to the prosecutors. The Foreign Office began a campaign of prevarication. Officials there delayed response to any request for information. Then, when pushed, forwarded wordy briefs which evaded all the questions put. British prosecution files preserve several of them. The kindest conclusion which can be drawn from the line they take is that officials who sent them did not really understand the Norwegian policy and were retailing their own confusion. Once confused, they may have obfuscated the issues further, fearing that departmental interest and international diplomacy were involved. Whatever the reason for Foreign Office policy, the result was to involve the British prosecution for months in anxiety which could have been allayed in a week, and to create the fear that the British government really had something very nasty to hide. In fact, for the specific purposes of the case at Nuremberg, and indeed in the long-term perspective of international law and diplomacy, they did not. A Foreign Office circumlocution for a long time muddied the history of policy towards Norway, which in fact fell into two distinct phases. The background to both was British awareness of the advantages which the capture of Norway could secure for the Germans, and the desire to deny them those advantages. Norway's coast provides a complex series of channels stretching for 400 miles, known as the Leads. These channels, protected and concealed by innumerable islands, could offer the German Navy safe routes into the Atlantic and secure hiding places from which sorties could be launched on Allied shipping. Possession of Norwegian ports would facilitate any attack on the Soviet Union and would prevent the German Navy being bottled up in the wet triangle, as they had been during the First World War. In British eyes, the most vital of these ports was Narvik. It was ice-free in winter, and furthermore, Sweden used it to export about 1/10 of her shipments of high-grade iron ore to Germany. The British and Nazi leaders tended to see these shipments as crucial, believing that they were Germany's only source of materials suitable for munitions, and that without them, Germany would be reduced to a mere year's campaign requirement. Some recent research suggests its importance was exaggerated. A seizure of Norway would have been a relatively simple matter. The Norwegians had been firm neutrals since 1918. They had been devoted adherents of the League of Nations, and having put their trust in collective action, had reduced their armed forces to the minimum. The Navy still had 2 pre-dreadnought ironclads. In the first stage of their policy towards Norway, the British had indeed planned to seize strategic Norwegian areas. But that plan had been drawn up in response to the Russo-Finnish War, which began on the 30th of November 1939. The Russian invasion of Finland had transgressed League rules. Members could show their devotion to its principles by going to the aid of the Finns. The British intended to do so by crossing Norway, who was obliged by League regulations to permit transit, disingenuously leaving on the way enough troops to secure the Swedish route to Narvik. Over 15,000 combat troops were at the ready. A further 42,000 were being prepared. The French were egging them on in the hopes of diverting Germany from Prague. All that was needed to launch the action was an official Finnish request for help. It never came. On the 12th of March, the date set for the British expedition, the Finns were obliged to make peace with Russia. Plans for the expedition were not immediately cancelled, but troops were soon dispersed. This British scheme as regards Norway had been of doubtful morality and tenuous legality. Obviously, in 1945, the Foreign Office would prefer it should not come to light. But the essential fact was that it had never been implemented. No actual crime had been committed, and an old abandoned plan could not be effectively quoted to justify a much later German invasion. Instead, the defendants would have to prove that this invasion was prepared and launched to prevent a known attempt by the British. And here they were on much weaker ground. The British had certainly decided on the 28th of March to order the mining of the leads. They might be territorial waters of a neutral country, but they had already been violated by the German military, as had been proved in February when the British rescued prisoners of war from the Altmark. Should the Germans retaliate for the mining by attacking Norway, then British troops were to be sent for her defense, but only if the Norwegian government requested aid. Warning of mine-laying was sent to Oslo on the 8th of April. The Norwegians robustly announced their intention to sweep them. But on that very day, the German Navy was already at sea, prepared for a synchronized landing and the seizure by force of several ports. This attack had been planned for many months and had received Hitler's approval on the 26th of March. British noses were clean on this matter. There had been no time to collect even the slight smut which might have been noticeable in their intention. But the Foreign Office saw neither the distinction between the two policies nor the legality of the second. As late as March 1946, their minutes commenting on the increasingly desperate prosecutors' pleas for enlightenment about British policy recalled their wish to avoid any discussion about Finland. One official candidly noted that in this stage of policy, the British had not been deterred by any moral grounds from committing an act which we have denounced as a most criminal breach of international law in others. It was an attitude summed up more succinctly by a colleague who wrote that there was a lot of funny business at the time, which they would prefer to conceal from the tribunal. The minutes also show the fear that any mention of Finland might tend to stir up old rancors and suspicions in the Russians. They show that the Foreign Office could hardly work out the details of the Norwegian policy themselves, even if they had wished to explain it to the team at Nuremberg. There was no central file on Norway. The documents were scattered among different departments and were difficult to track down, since each department had given a different code name to each step of planning. Only in late March, when an official was sent to Paris to confer with the Quai d'Orsay, did anyone stumble on the vital discovery that most of the documents in the white books on which the defense seemed to lean had not been captured in Norway, but from General